Anton, I agreed with you. I wouldn't actually make a formal presentation, though I can always talk for as long as you like. But I think we should go immediately into discussing what you think the issues are, what objections you have to the line I take in my book, which is pretty radical, particularly since I now want to make say something which I've been reluctant to in the past. But I actually think that we must make a distinction between cognitive consciousness and phenomenal consciousness, and that cognitive consciousness is much more ancient. Cognitive consciousness was developed early in evolution, something corresponding to a global workspace on the Bars model. Nature long ago discovered that as a very useful way of integrating information and helping decision making and so on. And it's very widespread throughout nature. Almost all animals have some version of it. So I think that consciousness of that sort is very deep and very widespread. But phenomenal consciousness arrived much later. It has a specific function of generating a new sense of self, which is particularly relevant to social animals like ourselves, and of course most mammals and most birds. But I don't think this exists in other animals, invertebrates, or for that matter, even in non-mammalian vertebrates. I think octopuses don't have that kind of experience, though they are cognitively conscious. They can certainly, make they can use information in ways which we would regard as an example of integrating information and decision making in a global workspace. But they do it without there being any phenomenal experience accompanying it. So I want to make this radical distinction between those widespread animals who have cognitive consciousness and the later arrival of maybe just mammals and birds about 200 million years ago, and of course dinosaurs probably would have been true as well. And we are unique otherwise in the animal kingdom. Now, this is a very unpopular view, at least with the people I've talked to. You'll have seen at Dharamshala, for example, amongst the very good philosophers and Buddhist monks we met there. They have a mission, which is to extend compassion and extend the idea of phenomenal consciousness much deeper across the animal kingdom, because they've recognized that in modern human society, there's insufficient recognition of the extent to which animals can have conscious feelings and even have phenomenal selves like us, like we do. So the mission is to push it further and further down across the animal scale. I think that's a mistake. I think it's a scientific mistake. And in the end, it's probably a moral mistake as well, because if we're mistaken and are much too promiscuous, profligate about extending the idea of phenomenal consciousness, feeling pain, experiencing pleasures and joys of living in the presence of sound and light and so on, of the kind which we take so seriously. If we extend that too far, we're diminishing it. We're not realizing just how special it is. And what's more, we're going to end up in an absurd position of arguing, for example, that artificial intelligence, because it has cognitive consciousness, could also have this other phenomenal dimension. You'll find most philosophers, if you look right for 50 years now, the idea has been that if we can explain cognitive consciousness, then phenomenal consciousness simply comes along with it. It's a kind of corollary for no obvious reason, for no obvious adaptive purpose, but simply because once you get one, you get the other. I think that's a scientific mistake, and it's part of what I want to do is to correct that. At the meeting in Sicily, which you were at, at the end of that, hinted that even, well, not hinted, I said that I've changed my mind even about blind sight. I think blind sight, when it's fully developed as it was in the monkey, which I studied, and in one or two human cases, in that case, the subject is consciously aware of vision, but nonetheless has no visual sensations. So there's a complete, blind sight is an extraordinary phenomenon because it drives this wedge between cognitive consciousness and phenomenal consciousness. But blind sight humans, I think, actually are able, they know they can see. And I recently looked up some new, a few years ago, it was actually a long time, 1913, I think, so 2013, I went to visit B. de Gelder in Brussels, where she was studying the only patient we know who has total blind sight, a man called T.N., a man from Rwanda, who had 2 successive strokes, which knocked out first the left side of his visual cortex, then the right side of his visual cortex. So he has no visual cortex. Most human cases of blind sight have only a partial damage to the cortex. Now, T.N. was remarkable. It turned out a long time ago that T.N. could navigate the world rather like my monkey Helen could. He can walk around avoiding obstacles and so on. But it goes much further than that. We know he can also recognize emotions in faces and things. And while I was with him a few years ago, and I just looked up this tape again to remind myself, we showed T.N. an illusion. It's the illusion which you're probably familiar with. You have dancing dots on a screen, and they can, if they're coming from the lights attached to the limbs of a human being, then when the person walks or dances or swings their arms, we read it as an animate object. We read these dots as being belonging to an animate being. And when they walk to the left or the right, we can see them walking. We showed this dot display. It's the one developed by Johansson in Sweden. And T.N. spontaneously said, "It's moving. It's moving, isn't it? He's marching. He'll march. He's walking. Which way which way is he walking? He's walking to the left. He's walking to the right." This is quite unlike any other example of blind sight that I know in humans, because it's clear that the subject is perceptually aware in a way which makes it actually practical value to him to perceive what's going on in the world. But he has no experience. He still maintains there's nothing there. He still says it's not like anything to see this. So I think it's, blind sight has traditionally been talked about as unconscious vision. But in this case, it's clearly not unconscious. The subject has access to his perceptions, and yet, nonetheless, he has no phenomenal experience. It's still not like anything for him to see. And the description which he and other blind sight patients give is that if I can see, because you can demonstrate I can see, it's not me that's doing the seeing. I have nothing to do with it. Myself isn't involved. And that's what I think is the crucial distinction, which once you get phenomenal consciousness, then the phenomenal self takes charge and becomes the author of experiences, the recipient of experiences. Just in the ways I see on the wall of your study there, you've got David Hume, who argued so many years ago that in the end, when you look into yourself to find out what's there, when you ask yourself finally, what am I? He says, all I can find is a stream of sensations. But he can do that because he is phenomenally conscious. When T.N., the blind sight subject, looks at himself, when he asks about vision, he doesn't find any stream of sensations. And therefore, he doesn't associate his self with his ability to see. Okay, but that's a particular line I've been taking in the new book. Well, not so much in some new writing I've been doing, and which I'm going to try and develop now, to make the strong case for splitting consciousness in these two ways. And it's not the same distinction which Ned Block makes. Many people say to me, oh, look, you're just arguing for what the American philosopher Ned Block argued for many years ago, when he distinguished between access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness. I think that was a crazy distinction. It's unhelpful. It's done a lot of damage because it rests on a conceptual mistake that you can have consciousness to which you have no access. Now, that's actually, it's a contradiction. Consciousness is your awareness of what you find when you look in on your own mind. What you don't have access to isn't conscious, and therefore there can't be any non-accessible consciousness. Phenomenal consciousness is accessible. We all know it is. That's why we study it. That's why we're fascinated by it. It's difficult to communicate, but we certainly have access to it. And I think we have access to it in the way we have access to other mental states, mental representations. So I'm not making the same distinction as Bloch, but I still want to use the word phenomenal consciousness for sensations, for mental states for which we want to say it's like something to be in these states. But they're only distinguished by their content, not by their access. We have access to all conscious states.
Thank you very much, Nick. Let's start our discussion. And the first, Artem, please.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you, Nick, for this brilliant book. It was a big pleasure to read it. And it's always important to see the story of the appearance of a theory. It is, in fact, very useful. Your personal biographical part is very useful for understanding your ideas. And for me, it was pleasure to meet a mention of James Turrell in your because there was an exhibition of Turrell in Moscow in 2011. I checked this before and I visited it, and I still use this artist as an example for many philosophical purposes. His work is very useful for various topics in philosophy, and I sometimes refer to this artist in my lectures. That's very nice to meet someone who likes him as well. And there are two questions. My question is very general, and I think that many people here want to ask this. So, is it right that you abandoned anti-realism about consciousness and now you are a realist, or you still do not want to accept this distinction?
Well, I don't want to ally myself with Chalmers or Strawson or any of the other realists who, make it as kind of, their metaphysics thinks that there is something, consciousness is as real as matter is. It isn't. I mean, I'm not a panpsychist, and of course I never will be. I think consciousness, phenomenal consciousness, is representation. It's an idea, but it's an idea of something which actually is the case. When I say it's like this for me to see red, that's really what it's like. What I feel about it. It describes my emotional and epistemic relationship to feeling red. And to say it's a mistake would just be to mischaracterize it. It may be that I mean that's why I wanted to get away from the impossible triangle as a parallel, because when we see the wooden figure, which is in a particular way, and so it looks to me like a real solid wooden object, which nonetheless has these impossible properties. Well, wrong. It isn't an object which has those impossible properties. It only seems to. Now, to say that it only seems to me that I'm in pain, or it only seems to me that I'm experiencing red in the way I do, is just a misunderstanding of the status of what's at issue here. It is like that for me, and it's the fact that it's like that for me which is driving so much of my own behavior and my view on the world and my view of what your world is like and so on. So, I mean, it's risky to label a theory as realist or not realist, but I'm not an illusionist now. And as I said, I'm in trouble with my dear colleagues Dan Dennett and Keith Frankish, because they say, I'm abandoning the cause, but I'm not. I think they've been exaggerating the story they want to tell. I've suggested that instead of illusionism, we should talk about surrealism. That actually that my phenomenal experience of red or of pain is something which makes it's not a mistake about redness. It's something which is amplifying, making redness have properties and connections to something, to a different kind of level of existence, and that's why it matters so much to us. But it's not a mistake. I mean, Keith Frankish says he's coming round to this idea of surrealism. He thinks it might be a better way of characterizing it. But I don't think Dan will be. I wrote a piece in reply to Keith Frankish about illusionism in that JCS article which he did, and I quoted Pablo Picasso there, because Picasso actually called himself a surrealist long before some of the more kind of eccentric ones like Salvador Dali did. Picasso said, "I make things which are more real than the real thing." And when he made a sculpture of a goat, for example, you may know it's made out of handlebars and scrap metal and so on. And then he says, "Look at my goat. It's goatier than a real goat. This is more of a goat than a real goat is." And that's the job of an artist, he said, is to get to the essence of things in the world and bring out this dimension this quality in them, which is somehow hidden and now I'm bringing to the surface. And I think that's much more like what phenomenal consciousness is for us. It brings us, it's bringing on a new dimension which adds to. It doesn't contradict the physical side of colors and things, but it adds to them and makes them have a significance which they couldn't otherwise have. And they have that significance because they have these qualities by virtue of what it's like for us to interact with them. What we experience the world, we experience ourselves as having these properties in relation to them. And that gives us a view of ourself, which is not an illusion. It's the way which, for henceforward, we conduct ourselves. It's terribly powerful. It's a psychological force, and it changes everything. But to come back to a question about realism, do you think? I mean, do you read me now as being a realist or not? What do you think a realist is?
I would say that it is still possible to ally you with illusionism, and it is still possible to add one thing and say, and phenomenal consciousness is real, and that's exactly what I'm describing here. So yeah, I think that it depends on your direct answer. So what would you like to say, that qualia are right there and they are exactly the thing described in your book, or it seems that you still are not prepared to claim this?
No, I think we make it. There's one way in which we suffer an illusion, is when we think of qualia as being properties of external objects, when we project these qualities out into the world. Now that's wrong. That is a mistake. They're not. These properties are properties of our relationship to the objects, how we feel about them. But by projecting them out into the world, we do an interesting thing, which is we connect to other people. And one of the points I wanted to make in this book is, okay, by believing that the smell of the rose is in the rose, or that the color of the redness is in the apple, I then want to have a bridge to what it's like to be another person interacting with these things, because what's red for me, what it's like for me to see red, will be what it's like for you to see red, mediated by this external object. But the quality itself doesn't exist in the object. It's entirely a subjective and personal relationship to the object. Anton's looking. Sorry. Yes.
I had another question, but it seems that it's better to move, because there are too many people who have their questions.
Well,
yeah.
Yes. So, Vadim, please.
I think Vadim and I have met, haven't we? We
Yeah,
did
Yes,
an
of
interview.
course. We have met, we discussed many hours, maybe.
Yes,
I'm very glad to see you again.
Yes, yes. And you asked me how I came up with the idea of the impossible triangle as a metaphor. And I'm afraid I've let you down because I've abandoned it now. I actually don't think it's a very useful metaphor because it gives the impression that consciousness is an illusion. And I don't really want to argue that these days. I've moved away from illusionism. I think that our experience of phenomenal consciousness, we're representing something real, which is what we feel is happening to us, what it's like, and that is as real as any other mental, psychological state. And therefore, the suggestion, if you compare it to an illusion like the impossible triangle, is that it's unreal, that it's a mistake. We think we're seeing something or experiencing something, but we're not really. I now believe that actually that's not the right way to talk about it. So I've pulled apart from Keith Frankish and Dan Dennett on that score. They don't like it. They think I'm an apostate. But nonetheless, that's my position now is that I think we should regard phenomenal consciousness as in its own right a real entity, which it's the way we represent what it's like for us to be living in the presence of red light or tastes or pain or whatever it may be. And it's not a mistake, it's not an illusion. So maybe we'll come back to that particular issue later on. Anyway, Vadim, very good to see you.
Of course.
I very much
Thank
enjoyed
you.
the discussion we had before.
Thank you. And thank you, Nicholas. First of all, I would like to thank you for your book also. I have read it with much interest and got to know quite a few things. Many claims you have made in this book seem to me quite convincing. I agree, for example, that sensations are connected with a specific behavior and that we can conclude to the presence of phenomenal consciousness on the basis of it. And your idea of a probable connection between phenomenal consciousness and warm blood is ingenious and very provocative and interesting indeed. Yesterday, we even invented a name of your position, thermopsychism or tempopsychism.
Okay, I should say, of course, Vadim, you know, in the book, when I make that suggestion, do you know the English expression, I'm flying a kite? I'm trying something to see how people will respond, because I'm not completely convinced, but I think it's an interesting possibility. And I've written it partly to provoke people because it gets the discussion going. In some ways, of course, it gets people so annoyed, they break off the discussions, and that's not helpful. I have a particular problem with octopus lovers. Ever since, have you seen a remarkable Netflix documentary called My Octopus Teacher? No, it's a wonderful fable.
You have,
yeah. But it's taken the world by storm. Everybody now believes that a diver in the South African Ocean, made friends with this octopus, and they had this intimate, deep understanding of each other. But it's a bit of it's not natural history. It's a kind of like an Aesop fable. They've invented this story. There were many octopuses involved in the filming. It took 8 years to film. Octopuses only have a life of 3 years. At the end of it, they had a huge array of material in the laboratory and wondered what to do with it. And they called in a Hollywood script writer to write a story. And out of that story, they could then edit a film with this wonderful narrative following through it. But it's fiction. It's very interesting, I think beautiful fiction, but it's not science. And anyways, I continually have to disappoint people by reminding them that that's not actually the way things are with octopuses. Octopuses don't the idea that an octopus, which has no friends with no other animal in the world, including any other octopus, would have the emotional and cognitive capacity to form friendship with a human being it's bizarre. It's obviously science fiction. But Vadim, sorry, to go back to your question. Yes, okay. You like the warm. What was the word? Thermopsychism. Yes.
But I have a few, of course, polemical remarks. But I guess I should ask one question as well as Artem, and maybe it will be a continuation of his question. That's because after all you've said, I don't quite understand how you understand the nature of phenomenal consciousness. You say that it is not an illusion. You stress this point even today, and that it represents sensation and so on. But my question is, what is the nature of such a representation or ideas, as you call them? Are they physical after all? Or how do they relate to the brain processes? Are they supervenient on them, for example? Or if yes, what kind of superveniency do we have here? That is between mental representation and brain processes. I don't quite understand your position here.
Well, I mean, so these are very deep questions about the nature of representation, but I tried to use an analogy of a written text. I gave the analogy of the novel Moby Dick. Moby Dick is a printed work on paper. That's the vehicle for the representation. When we read it as a story about a white whale, but there's nothing white or whale-like in the physical text. So the representation isn't a physical thing. It is just what we just said it was. It's an idea. It's a description of a possible existence, but it's at the level of representation and no more. It hasn't got. I mean, I think representations are real, but they're not physically real, and it's supervenient. Yes, I'm sure it's supervenient on the physical substrate, on the vehicle, but it doesn't have to be. I mean, there could be a one-to-one relationship even, but I quite believe that actually we could represent red in my brain or Anton's brain or your brain in different ways. So yes, it's supervenient. But I'm going to throw the question back at you. What are you going to do with this answer? Why do you think that's an interesting question? If we understand what I mean when I talk about representation, that it's the mental state of which has this particular role in our mental economy of change, of progressing thoughts and so on, and helping make decisions. That's what it is, and that's a functional definition. And that's sufficient, I think, to give it the kind of status, epistemological status, which we need in science. Representations are entities in good standing in physical science, without actually being physical objects. So I mean that. What if I say
yes, I see. Yes. Maybe because we look at the problem of consciousness from a different angles. For philosophers, such questions are very interesting because answers to such questions help to specify the ontological status of consciousness. But I'm not sure that you consider your own theory as philosophical theory. Am I right?
Why is there a difference? It's a theory of why consciousness exists, how it arises in the brain, why it evolved under natural selection, and the role it plays in our lives. Now, of course, it's potentially a scientific theory. I want it to be one, but it's a philosophical theory as well, isn't it? I mean, it doesn't solve questions, about metaphysics. I agree about about where this. where consciousness fits in this, in the kind of all the possible ontological nets of existence in the universe. But it does the job of, all I want to do is to, I mean, for myself, we all begin with our own experience. I want to know why I have these experiences. The kind of answer I ask is, why did my ancestors develop the kinds of brains which these experiences, which elicit these kind of experiences, and to understand, therefore, what I would be missing without it, why it's such a wonderful gift that I've got it, and how it helps me function in the world of other humans and maybe other animals who have similar experiences. Well, you're right, of course, I'm not a philosopher. I've never done a degree in philosophy in my life. And so maybe I don't understand what a philosophical theory is, which a scientific theory isn't.
But philosophical theory, the theory of consciousness, which is interested of such questions as the questions I asked about supervenience, identity, and so on kinds of supervenience, logical, natural supervenience, and so on.
Yeah, supervenience is a perfectly good notion in physics. So it's not a exclusively philosophical notion. I think philosophers have helped brain scientists to ask the right questions, and the idea of supervenience is in use in neuroscience these days. It's not necessarily exactly the same one as philosophers have had. I mean, I think when Hare, was it the moral philosopher, first started using supervenience, he was using it in a way which made it relevant to areas of study which are rather different from brain science, which we now conduct. But when we say that the experience or the representation supervenes on a brain state, it's what I mean by that is that it's a many-to-one mapping. There's many possible ways of realizing this state, and so you can't change the experience without changing the substrate, but you can change the substrate without changing the experience. And isn't that what supervenience means? And isn't that a scientific hypothesis?
Yes, of course. I have no doubts that you have an opinion on this topic, but my point is that you, and thank you for your answer, but you don't discuss this in your book, and you seem that you don't think that it's important question, as you himself just said.
Well, forgive me, of course, there's lots of things I don't discuss in the book, because partly because I've discussed some of them elsewhere, and partly because it's a book for general readers. I don't necessarily want to get into technical issues in philosophy, and probably you would be right to say that I'm not competent to do that either, because I'm not a philosopher. I think in the general sense, I think like a philosophe, but I don't think like Armstrong or Kripke or whoever it may be.
Anyway, Nicholas, thank you very much for your response, for your answers. I have, of course, another questions, but I think that we really should move on.
I just wanted to ask something. I'm very glad you read the book. You read it in English, presumably, because that's where it's available. But I think it's being published in Russian soon. And
yes.
I wonder, has anybody got any information about that? Anton said he might find out.
Yes, Nick, I asked the publisher, but they didn't respond to me, and now I'm trying to find personal contact with the publishing house, and maybe I'll receive some response, and I'll let you know about it.
Okay, because as I've said, and I'm sure everyone here will appreciate, I would very much like to have a friend like Anton read it before it's published, because it's very easy to get some of these ideas wrong in translation.
Yes.
Thank you, Vadim, anyway.
Thank you very much.
Artem, please.
Greetings, Professor Humphrey. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss your book. I had a question on the connection between phenomenal consciousness and the sense of importance and dualistic ontologies or other things like that. So as far as I understand, you draw a connection between this thick representation of phenomenality in our sensations and conceptions of ourselves, of why do we think that our minds are immaterial, of why there are souls, etc. But I think there is a discrepancy between, on one hand, phenomenal consciousness, and the reasons why people, at least philosophers, postulate a kind of immaterial existence for persons. Phenomenal consciousness is a very concrete iteration, I think, in the development of ideas about why it's weird to be us, so about the first-person perspective. And usually, well, maybe not usually, but quite often, the reasons of why people present their ideas about dualism are not about sensations, but about intentional states, like thought, like the sense of self, the sense of agency, and they're not perceptual. And I wanted to ask, phenomenal consciousness, is it a cause or also a reason for why we conceive ourselves as perhaps as immaterial agents? Or is it also a reason? Because if it's a cause, and usually it's not, well, at least for, I don't know, for Descartes, it's not a reason. The reason is conscious thought of finding myself thinking, and it's not phenomenal. But if it's just a cause, why does this thick phenomenality cause us to think about intentional states? Because it's not obvious. If it were different, for example, if like there were phenomenal states and we find ourselves sentient and find our feelings thick and thought-provoking, and then we would arrive to dualistic ontologies, it would be quite explainable. But the route sometimes is not like that. It's not through sentience. And the history of philosophy of mind does not necessarily deal with sentience. So it could be accidental almost that perception became this milestone in discussing the mind. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
No, I think that's a very interesting point, and I'm sure you're right about it. You're right, at least in the way the post hoc explanations which philosophers give for developing their theories. But I'm sure if we took Descartes, for example, although he, in a sense, he makes it very cerebral, very intellectual argument for the existence of his self, and my guess is the motivation is that sitting on the stove in his room, in wherever it was, he was feeling his bottom being warmed by it. He was feeling his body being present there. That's what gave him the impetus to begin asking questions about what am I? What can I doubt about myself? And it's, you know, he arrives at a theory which would be equally applicable to a robot or an AI. Once we start talking about AI consciousness, and I'm sure we are, it'll be cognitive consciousness. And no doubt the AI could actually develop a sense of self. I say that in my book. I think you could have a sense of self which wasn't based on phenomenal sensation. It could simply be, you know, a kind of common denominator which you arrive at in trying to understand what the origin of mental states is and how they interact. And it might be useful to postulate some kind of symbol in the middle there, which is actually the node at which these things come together. But I don't think that actually in the history of living animals that was sufficient, because I think this did precede phenomenal consciousness. Once phenomenal consciousness came in, the idea of authorship, of me, of my singular importance at the center of this network of thoughts and intentional states and so on, became much more impressive. And I would suggest that in the development of a child's thinking, again, it's where it begins. The baby infant hasn't even probably got phenomenal consciousness to begin with, but once it arrives, the world begins to make sense to this baby, because it now it can center its model, its explanation around the idea of a self, which I agree, it's very hard to articulate exactly what it means, but very few people would deny they know what it means. I mean, they may, like Hume, come to the conclusion that all it is sensation and be rather surprised by that. But I come to the same conclusion and think, gosh, it's sensation, and isn't that extraordinary? At the center of our mental life, we have an agent which is the subject of all our other conscious states. It is the subject of perceptions and memories and thoughts and so on, but which nonetheless has this kind of glow to it. I mean, I know it's a silly metaphor, but there's somebody at home there, and that is for simple-minded humans, that's the kind of model which we know how to work with. We can understand what it's like to have a self as the author of our actions and our decisions and the mediator of our dreams and so on, because we can kind of point to it and say, yes, that's what I am. I think that it's a matter of the salience of this concept. I think that the self which would be developed and will be developed by AI will not have this impressive quality, and it won't be something which we will naturally, or the AI will naturally attribute to other beings like itself and so on. So it's a psychological theory of the self. I think the qualities of the self which we have been given by nature, by evolution, have some very special, almost rhetorical properties to them. They work in a dramatic way, which isn't just an accident. I mean, it's a very good story we tell about ourselves. And there may be other ways of doing it, but it's not obvious that anybody will know, any other animal has developed them, or yet that a machine will. So I think, yes, I think you'd be right to say that my theory is a psychological theory of the self, not a metaphysical one. It's not, I mean, and I think that you're absolutely right to say that in the history of philosophy, that's not the way it's been articulated, but my guess would be it is the story of why people became interested in these issues, because they were so impressed by this strange presence at the center of their life, which isn't observable by other people, and yet which seems to have a corresponding locus in other people, and we can't see theirs. But nonetheless, when we find that, when we make the leap to assuming that other people have an equivalent center of self to our own, the world opened up in terms of social interaction and theory of mind and so on. So it's a terribly good story. Dan Dennett has talked about the self as the center of narrative gravity. He doesn't mean it in the same way as I do, but I think what's very important is its role in the narrative. With what we need is something to steer through the history of our own lives, future and past, which we can always identify. We can it's a ball we can hold in the air and value in its own right. And what's more, it's something which so obviously disappears and returns. I think one of the most impressive psychological facts about being a phenomenally conscious human is sleep and waking. We lose, our self vanishes. It may reappear in dreams and so on, but basically it becomes obliterated when we lose consciousness in sleep. And yet by a kind of miracle, we wake up and there it is again. And it's the same self. And I describe a bit in the book why we might identify it as the same self, because the qualities, the peculiar stylistic qualities of our own consciousness are still present yesterday, today, tomorrow. They may not be the qualities which other people have, but nonetheless, so they are singularly important to ourselves, and they give us the sense of continuity. But we need, I mean, something has to be there which tells us that when we re-awake from sleep, we are the same person, we are the same self. And I'm not sure that intentional states would do it. But maybe one could invent I'm sure, example of a case of artificial consciousness, which could have some kind of icon in the center which did it. But you know, the way we've done it is manifestly very effective. And I'm not sure that it could have been better. I mean, nature has been very good, as she always is, in coming up with a pretty amazing solution to the problem, which was presented by, for example, how do we think about continuity in our lives? It's also, to come back to some of Vadim's questions, it's the reason, of course, that we also then want to take it beyond life. Just as we rediscover ourselves when we wake up, again and again and again, throughout our lives, we've had this extraordinary evidence of the continuity of the self, that it's immortal, that it doesn't disappear, it reoccurs, and it's the same self which reoccurs. It gives us every reason to think that it will survive death. And I'm sure that that's been very important in generating ideas about the soul and the afterlife, which have become culturally terribly important. And actually, I think, a part of the adaptive value of consciousness for us. I think these ideas, at least for humans, of an immaterial soul have been crucial in our development of civilization and of our relationships with each other. So they have biological effects, and natural selection will have continued to work on them. I mean, natural selection didn't stop at the point at which we first began to think about the human soul. The human soul has been improved since then, and no doubt it's got further to go still.
Thank you for your informative answer.
Don't look totally convinced, but that's all right.
Yes. So, Evgeny.
Hello.
Hi, Eugene.
I also want to start with a thank you for your book. It was very interesting to read. So I find the idea of distinguishing between sensations and perception very good. It is a very good idea. The idea that the warm blindness is somehow related to qualia is very good also. And the story about Broad and some paranormal reality was very surprising for me. I didn't know anything about that. It was quite shock.
Really?
So the question is about your phenomenal surrealism. You in your paper against illusionism, you write that about the case about Picasso and the goat, and so you formulate your thought that so phenomenological redness is redder than real red, and phenomenological pain is painer than real pain. So my question is, what in your mind is the real pain, which we are comparing with phenomenological pain? What do you mean by real pain in distinguish between being distinguished with phenomenological pain?
I mean, I'm so grateful. You're the only person I know who's read this paper of mine. So thank you for that. Because as I say, I quite like it, and like Keith Frank is quite likes it too. Yeah, it's a very good question, and I don't provide an analysis of that in that very short paper. But what Picasso meant was that there are, for a goat has certain obvious properties as a living animal and so on. Only some of those make it into a goat. all sorts of things make it a mammal, a physical object, etc., etc. Or just as when Van Gogh paints a chair, what he's trying to do in some ways, and he's explicit about it, is to represent the essence of chairness. And so, as I think by saying it's surreal is, it may not even be the right question. I'm using it in Picasso's sense, not in the Dali-like sense. I don't mean mystical and unreal. I mean even more real. What it picks out is what the central qualities of this thing are, which make it a chair, or make it red, or make it salt, or whatever it may be. So in a sense, it's a caricature. It might be better than to call it surreal. But it's not a new idea, of course, that artists have continually attempted to get at the underlying reality of the things which they depict by exaggerating them in all sorts of ways. I think I quote in the book, but I've got many other quotes, saying that for artists, for Goff, Picasso, whoever it is, saying, I don't try and draw or paint nature. I try and paint what nature is not, but which in a sense it evokes the idea of in ourselves. And that's, I think, to come back to, and I think if one had to talk about we have been talking about as the phenomenal self as even more of a self than the functional self, which we were discussing earlier on. It gives it psychological salience. It gives it a kind of edges. It gives it ways of distinguishing from other comparable objects and so on, which become extremely useful as a way of thinking about the world. I mean, qualia are good to think with, to use the term used by Levi-Strauss about animals. He said maybe humans have a long time liked to think in terms of animal categories. I think qualia categories are very good to think with. And I give an example actually in the book, because people have asked me, I give an example of how it helps to think in qualia terms. And I give the example of sensory modalities, because they don't exist in the physical world. There's no difference in the patterns of firing in an auditory nerve or in the visual optic nerve or in the nerves from our taste buds. Nonetheless, at the level of experience, we found ways of sharply delineating different modalities of experience, which is unreal. The kinds of energy don't have those sharp distinctions in the world. Difference in light waves and sound waves is real, of course, but it doesn't have that sharp cutoff which it has in the difference between visual qualia and auditory qualia. And then I give some reasons in the book for saying, well, why would it have helped us to think about the sensory modalities as belonging to these completely different realms? And that's, I'd suggest, it's not been discussed elsewhere, and I haven't really developed it, but it could well be because in interacting with other people, we need to take account of which sense organs they're using, because different sense organs have different affordances. The different things it makes a real difference whether I think somebody's basing their behavior on what they see or what they smell or what they hear. And by attributing to them, by reading their minds as if this means they're using sensory systems which have these different kinds of qualitative dimension to them, it helps me home in and understand the kinds of experiences which they're having, which is actually, it's going to be very good in predicting their behavior. So, sorry, now I'm losing track. Where do we start on that one? Oh.
Yeah, we started with the question about what is the real pain. So your answer is that the real pain means a functional pain. And when we represented it, it becomes a phenomenological pain. Pain.
I think that's right. I think I'd say something like that. Yeah,
Thank you.
But I urgently need some clever people like you to develop these ideas.
Oh, okay. So we can move on. Anna.
Nick, nice to see you, and thank you to share your ideas from the new book. It's really great. I am still in continental philosophy, and so special thanks to mention Nietzsche and some others who do not representative to this analytical way to take things and discuss a question about consciousness. I have a lot of questions then, because, for example, maybe the main question is that question about why are you sure that we have the sense of self? For example, Sartre has the idea that we have no sense of our own bodies, and the same situation with our own language. So we can hear others, we can look at other body, and in your book you underline that animals see other animals as individuals, and has even respect. Animal without language has respect for the selves of others. But are we sure that we have the idea of ourselves? So we have this idea of others, we have the sense of others, maybe we listen to others, but we cannot listen to ourselves. So maybe we have some extra trust to be sure to have the sense of ourselves.
Well, as you say, we can't listen to ourselves. Dan Dennett has said that actually that's one of the key processes which helps us develop a sense of self, this kind of looping which goes on. He quotes the novelist E.M. Forster, who says, "How do I know what I think till I hear what I say?" But it's, you know, it's very hard to imagine a life in which we didn't use the terminology of the self. The word I recurs again and again, not only in social interaction, but in private thought and in memories and everything else. Clearly, we make use of a sense of an idea of the self, which is represented by a very singular syllable, both in Russian and in English. It's and it's difficult to believe that this doesn't have a referent for us. Now, I think we can get more and more sophisticated about it and begin to pull it apart, and even talk about how we could continue to exist even if we could get rid of the ego, get rid of the I, which of course is one of the goals of certain philosophers, and obviously of Buddhism, for example. I think it's a very strange goal. I think it's an interesting exercise, but not as a way of cleaning the mind or making it more compassionate. I think it's possible it has the opposite effect. I think the I is crucial to how we mind about other things in the universe, and without it, if we don't believe in our own I, we won't believe in the I of other entities either, and therefore it's not going to represent a moral step upwards. But I mean, it's difficult to know what to say. Would you say what Sartre does? I mean, philosophers say all sorts of things, and we listen to them and we learn from them, but we don't necessarily, I think, want to identify with the worldview which they have. And I find I can't with Sartre. Nietzsche I find rather easier, I have to say. That's partly because Nietzsche made fun of himself in a way Sartre does not.
Could I make a short comment with a short question? But for example, even if we take example from animal world, non-human animals, let's be correct. So we see the situation that we accept the selves of others, but we totally forget about ourselves. So that's the idea that the compassion could be arrow with one direction. So to be passive in this interaction. And maybe it's this I that appear not from the beginning of the phenomenal consciousness. It's coming with narrative skills, and it's about storytelling. So that's we found our I and our agency. It's not coming first. So that's the idea is that it could be a narrative simulation or something like this, and could be, for example, be reconstruct artificially. It's a provocation, of course.
Yes, no, I know what you're saying, and of course, the people who've talked about this, the personal I, the social I, the family I, and so on. We can be a different I in different contexts. But I think it's very hard to get rid of the core notion of one singular self at the center of it. And interestingly enough, in all the many kinds of damage with the disintegration of the self, which can occur through brain damage, the one thing which never seems to go is the sense the person has of being there at the center of sensations. They may lose all sorts of other ideas of relationships and everything else, but they persist. And so it's, I mean, and you're raising very interesting points. And of course, developmental psychologists have become interested in them. And they don't take the same line as I do in a lot of ways. I mean, Alison Gopnik, for example, argues that we only learn what it is to be a self through interaction with other people. And because we find ourselves attributing selfhood to others, we then say, well, gosh, I must be a self as well, because they're treating me as if I'm a self. I think it's very interesting, the dynamics of that. And so, you know, I can't mount a particularly strong defense of what I'm saying. I just think it works as a way of pulling a lot of material together, and it may be wrong in many ways. I mean, we write books in order to provoke criticism, and this is now my 8th book about consciousness, and I wouldn't have been writing more and more if I got it right first time. Of course, I'm saying, no, this is my last one. I'm now writing a book on aesthetics, so to get on to something else.
Now you have to come and to present the Russian translation, so we are waiting for you.
Well, of course I'd come. Yeah, when I'm allowed to. It's
okay.
Yes. Well,
so it's
thank
my turn. Yes, and Nick, again, thank you very much for your book. It's you are great at storytelling, and there's autobiographical things are very interested, I believe, for everyone. And what's interesting is that you see that there is no huge connection between morality and phenomenal consciousness, and we can care about animals even though many animals like phenomenal consciousness, and it honestly it fits well. Yeah, sorry.
Anton, I don't say there's no connection. I just say it's not the only thing which matters. I think
yes.
Sentience is relevant to how we treat animals because it allows us to employ the golden rule of how would I want you to behave to me if I was in your place, and that, I think, Sentience makes that an understandable exercise, which it wouldn't be if a non-sentient animal. On the question of the autobiography, have you seen Dan Dennett's new book?
Yes, we've seen, and I know Vadim has finished reading the book, and I'm in the process of reading.
I thought I knew I was taking a risk in telling a lot of personal stories in this book, and then when I saw Dan doing it in his one, I threw up my hands and thought, gosh, is this how it comes across? Because I found that the balance in Dan's book is not right, that he tells too many stories about what a wonderful person he is without necessarily giving the reader a reason to be interested in the stories as a way of getting into the science or the philosophy. But so I've been very nervous for Dan. As you know, Dan is one of my closest friends. But the great thing is that, being Dan Dennett, any criticism rolls right off him like water off a duck's back. He doesn't get hurt by it, so that's good. Because some people have said that this narrative style was a mistake. But anyway, good. I'm glad. Maybe the answer is we should always write our memoirs earlier in life. By the time we've only got a lot so self-important. I don't know. But you know, Dan is 81. I'm 80 years old now. What's interesting is, what do you think? I mean, as I said in that book, I can kind of trace a really quite coherent story. It was all luck and serendipity, but nonetheless, one thing led to another, and so there's a kind of it makes me slightly worried now. Why should there have been such an obvious connection between the very different things I did, which I now pull together in one book? And am I kidding myself that this is really something which makes sense? But maybe it is, among other stories which have made sense. But the point I wanted to do, my point of telling those stories was to give people a very soft introduction to some of the concepts which I then wanted to use.
What strikes me the most is your very interesting point that the ability to be interested in other minds, or an ability of an organism to recognize others as having mental states, is a great sign of having consciousness. So if an animal has that ability, it is sufficient and it is safe to say that it is conscious. But what is the connection between this ability and consciousness itself? Because when you define sensation as sensation is about what's happening to me, you said. So this definition does not have any direct connection to the ability of recognizing others as conscious beings and so on. And I would imagine a creature which lacks this ability, but still has consciousness. And if it's true, would it be a problem for you when you say that some animals like octopuses, some invertebrates are unconscious? But is it really a point? I mean, if we can divorce sexuality and consciousness, should we say that we can recognize that octopus is has consciousness?
Well, it's what I was talking about at the very beginning. I think yes, but we have to be very careful about our terms. I think octopuses are cognitively conscious, and I think that they have access to their own mental states, and they can use this for planning, decision making, and so on. And as I said, I think the idea of a global workspace it was always a very good formula for helping to develop a cognitive engine which would function in the world. So I think octopuses have that, and they could, and I say it again in the book, I think that without phenomenal consciousness, it wouldn't be impossible to have a sense of self, and it wouldn't be impossible to then start recognizing that kind of self in other creatures. But I just think it's much less likely to happen. So this isn't an absolute distinction that you couldn't have it without. But given the ways in which we know that we work with our own sense of self in attributing it to others, that kind of procedure is not obviously available to an animal which doesn't have phenomenal consciousness. And we'll have to see what engineers come up with. They may well find some better way even of developing theory of mind and so on in artificial machines. But maybe given the constraints of biological material, biological brains, there was no other way that we could have done it so well. It may also be that the way we do it is such a good technique that actually engineers are going to find some way of using the same tricks for developing self-consciousness and phenomenal consciousness in machines. But they won't do that until they need to. And at the moment, of course, there's no call on people developing artificial intelligence to give them that kind of social capacity. Now, there will be rather soon, I think, precisely because one of the roles for artificial intelligence is increasingly in order to interact with humans in social ways and to make our lives easier. It's much easier to interact with a machine which behaves like a dog than it is the one which behaves like a washing machine. So it's just as companions, non-human human companions, are very important to us, and we work with them because, in the case of a dog, we have every reason to believe that the dog is sentient, and every reason to believe the dog believes that we're sentient, and there's this trading going on. It may be that we'll want to have that sort of relationship with machines at some point, and maybe let's see what turns out to be a good way of doing it. We've said it already in this discussion. There may be alternative routes to developing it, but I suspect that the alternative routes would not involve sentience as we understand it, phenomenal consciousness as we understand it, and therefore would not necessarily command our moral, ethical attention in the way in which it does for us. You're right to say that I think it's very, very important not to link sentience to absolute status, to value in the animal kingdom. I mean, plants aren't sentient, but we value them in all sorts of ways, and we have every reason to want to protect them and to ensure that they live fulfilling lives in the sense of a plant that means something for a plant. I really don't want to say that animals which are non-sentient are insignificant, but I do want to say that they're not as significant or in the same ways as human beings are, and we know that's true. I mean, I wouldn't, let's say there's no reason to use this in practical ways, but I have every reason to believe that fetuses are not sentient. That would make a real difference to me if I was considering issues such as abortion, for example. But on the other hand, I would also say that we shouldn't just abort fetuses as if they'd had no significance at all, because they are potential human beings and so on, and they do have ontological status in their own right, but not as sentient creatures. I've just written a piece, I'll send it to you, which is for Wired magazine. They want a prediction for 2024, and my prediction is that some government somewhere is going to pass a law saying that insects are sentient, just as the British government has passed a law saying that octopuses and crabs are sentient. And I ask what the consequences of that would be in practice, and whether it isn't actually a dangerous move, partly because if we attribute sentience to insects, and we really mean it, we put ourselves in jeopardy all the time, because we can't live our lives without killing and maiming and destroying insect life. It's difficult enough not to do it in life. I mean, we had a rat infestation in my house. I called in the rat catcher to catch those rats and destroy them. It's not a moral thing to have done. But if we started believing that about insects in the way in which, let's say, religious Jains do in Rajasthan, then I think it potentially is it's going to be very limiting on human life. And it's going to make us feel guilty in ways we shouldn't do. It's going to prevent us from doing things we should be doing, like perhaps farming insects in order to replace supplies of protein from mammals and cows and things. And so we need the science and the philosophy here has practical consequences. And I end that piece by saying, in the war, we'd see this last Second World War in Britain, there was these posters everywhere saying, "Careless talk costs lives." And I end up this piece on Sentience saying, "Careless talk about sentience costs lives too."
Thank you very much. And okay, Taras.
Hello, Professor Humphrey. Thank you for your book, for opportunity to have such a great discussion, to be a part of it. I have one question. It's a metaphysical one. It's mostly to continue line which Artem Petrovich and Vadim Valerievich started. You partially answered it when you answered Vadim Valerievich's question, but I still want to clarify something, because I have some sympathies for illusionism, and I want to know how much does your position differs from its for now. So my question is, if I understand correctly, when you write about zombies in your book, by zombie you mean any creature that do not have phenomenal consciousness. But what do you think about philosophical zombies as creatures that are physically identical to humans, but still lack consciousness? Are they logically possible? As I understand it, your theory assumes that based on what we already know about our physiology, we have good reasons to think that such creatures cannot exist in any possible world, that there is no logical possibility to exist for them. And you already said that consciousness is supervenient on physical, and you mean logical supervenience. That in this case, I'm also wondering what you have to say about the possibility of beings that have relatively simple physiology, such that in our world you wouldn't recognize them as having consciousness. Is it logically possible for them to have consciousness? More general version of my question can be formulated as maybe, may consciousness somehow related to special laws of nature, or it's entirely dependent on the internal structure of the creature? Thank you. That's my question.
Okay, well, that's a big question. Yeah, the answer is I don't believe in philosophical zombies. I think they are logically incoherent. I use the term psychological zombies in my book to talk about creatures which lack phenomenal consciousness but have a cognitive consciousness. It's risky to do that, because people, of course, do think that I'm talking about David Chalmers' kind of zombies, which I'm not. I think that there are, they're very good arguments against the logical possibility of the kind of zombies you're talking about, and there would be against the possibility that this primitive creature in some other world, which would be have the it would have the identical. You're suggesting would have the identical brain structures in some respects, are you, to those we know in this world, and yet not be sentient? I'm not sure of the question about if we came across some primitive animal somewhere else, what would we want to say about it? I think we would say if it's it's actually the question only becomes manageable when we talk about creatures which have identical bodies and brains to those we know are conscious in this world. Many versions of that, I mean, are not very easy to formulate. I mean, you're thinking of, I mean, if we don't have any reason to think that an amoeba, for example, is sentient, and so the idea that an amoeba is a zombie, or there could be a zombie version of an amoeba which was different from the amoebas which actually we encounter on Earth, doesn't arise, because there's nothing that the amoeba apparently would be lacking. In the case of possibility that animals have zombie versions, I just, sorry, I'm going around in a circle, but I don't actually see where you get any entry to this problem. I mean, what point will you say, here's an animal which would, if it was one of us, have these internal mental states, but being what it is, an alien zombie animal, it doesn't. And yet it continues to behave as if it does, and to simulate the kind of behaviors which we recognize as evidence sentience in normal mammals and birds and humans. I think the answer would be that, show me one. I mean, there's no reason there's no reason to think it could in principle exist, unless you really are a dualist. Are you? I mean, do you find dualism attractive as a metaphysical?
No, I don't think I have a great sympathy to illusionism, and my question is, I want to clarify what is your position in this respect differs from illusionism, as can it understand it now? It doesn't.
No, it doesn't. I mean, look, let's be clear. I mean, I don't want to call myself an illusionist anymore, but I'm much closer to illusionism than to almost every other position in philosophy, like panpsychism or integrated information theory, or any of those theories, which I think are actually they can't deliver. Illusionism can deliver. It's a useful way to talk about to clarify what we could mean by talking about creatures as being conscious or not conscious. I just think that it's actually not a helpful way to talk about it. I can agree with all the implications of illusionism in practical terms, and I do agree with them, without wanting to adopt the political and language of illusionism. It's not only, you know, this is politics in a way. I mean, when I discuss these issues with Dan and Keith, for example, and they get so puritanical about it and say, look, you're spoiling our story, you're losing the audience for this extreme and obviously correct position by watering it down and not using terms like illusionism. I say just the opposite. I look at your success in the general intellectual atmosphere of 2023 or 24. Illusionism isn't winning. In fact, it's ignored by a great many philosophers who are speaking about it now. And Dan Dennett, unbelievably, is being sidelined, as if he's no longer an important philosopher, as if he's has had some interesting things to say about cognitive science and so on, but that was in the past, and we can ignore some of his positions these days. I think that's terrible, because when we find Dennett being replaced by Philip Goff as the kind of front edge of discussions on consciousness, it just makes me despair. We've really gone backwards, but the world does go backwards. I don't have a kind of Whiggish view of the development of thought. I think that we may well go quite a lot further back into incoherent and unhelpful theories of consciousness before we re-emerge. It happens in politics too, as we all know.
Thank you.
Andrey?
Yeah, Nicholas, thank you very much again for this wonderful book. It was a pleasure to read it. And I have tons and tons of questions. I will pick just one. It would be about introspection and the idea of the transparency or diaphanousness of consciousness and phenomenal consciousness specifically for introspection. On page 10, you wrote that the one thing I know is I'm sentient. In our own case, it seems we do indeed have extraordinary evidence. We are directly acquainted with the phenomenal properties of sensations by introspection. And the possibility of this introspective knowledge about our own phenomenal consciousness seems to be crucial for much of your reasoning about phenomenal consciousness, mind reading, and so on. But still, of course, you know that there are strong reasons to believe that introspection cannot grasp phenomenal consciousness. As George Edward Moore puts it, that when we try to introspect the sensation of blue, all we can see is the blue, and the other element, that is our own awareness of this blue, is as if it were diaphanous. And Fredetsky also argued that introspection cannot provide us with any evidence about our own consciousness, and so cannot give us knowledge that we are aware of something or that we are sentient. Well, for example, if I'm in pain, I can know that this pain exists, that it is hard, etc. But it seems that nothing is in this pain itself can tell me that I'm aware of this pain. And so there seems to be nothing in this pain that can serve as an evidence about my awareness of it, so about my sentience. So my question is, what do you think about this idea of transparency of phenomenal consciousness to introspection, since it seems to contradict your idea that we have strong and extraordinary evidence about our own awareness and sentience? And more general, what do you think about introspection generally? How do you understand it? Do you accept some particular theory of introspection? Since in the passage I've cited, you appeal to the idea of direct acquaintance. Elsewhere, you use the metaphor of the inner eye. I know that it is the title of your previous book, one of your previous books, but there you do not talk about introspection. So maybe some other theory you prefer. Can you please?
First answer would be one sense in which I think it's transparent what my mental states are, is that I am the author of them. And I've made a lot in my earliest book, The History of the Mind, in about how my theory of sensations is an adverbial theory. I am the actor creating this experience. And therefore, it's impossible to deny, for me to deny, that it exists. I can't, insofar as I act, and then my action is transparent to me, that I am the author of it. And so we're not having to get it by reflection or whatever else it is. And I argue in this book that actually that leads to a theory of what sensations are, that they do originate as actions. And what makes this action mine, for example, I mean, which is a deep and interesting question about why sensations seem inalienably to belong to the subject. I think they belong to the subject in just the same way that actions belong to the subject, and that and that's sort of, it's a very important correspondence. It gives us a sense of why we are so involved in the experience, because it's the experience which we ourselves are doing. I've used to say in the early books, sensations are some things we do. And I still am saying that, though I've elaborated into a slightly more complicated version of doing. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question, and I don't know Dretsky's work on this very well, for example. But my model of introspection is this rather old-fashioned one, I agree, of the NRI. I think there is a field of the brain which we basically access through something equivalent to an NRI, sense organs, yes, which gives us access.
Would it be, I beg your pardon, would it be correct to say that you prefer some kind of perceptual model of introspection?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Yes. That's cognitive. I mean, yes. Yeah. Because and just as my visual perception represents things as they are out in the world, I think my introspection represents things as they are in my mind or in my brain. But of course, we don't represent them as brain states. We represent them as thoughts and colors and other sorts of representations.
Yeah, but when we discuss some kind of actions like speech acts, for example, and when you driving a bicycle, etc., it seems that I can perceive you action like this. I can hear your voice and your speech act. I can see how you drive your bicycle, etc. But it seems that I cannot perceive your sentient. I mean, I cannot perceive you are aware of rainbow, that you are aware of something else. And that seems to be true for my own perception also. It seems that introspectively, by introspection, I cannot grasp an evidence that I am aware of my pain, that I am aware of I'm seeing red, etc. As different from pain itself, red itself, etc.
Well,
so maybe you will just point out to what could serve as this kind of evidence.
Well, I'm not sure. Let's not talk about the evidence first. Thomas Reid, whom I rely on a lot for good ideas about the nature of consciousness, said that we don't feel pain, we pain. He made it into an active verb. And I elaborated on that, saying we don't see red, we red, and we blue, and we salt, and so on. It's something which is actually part of which we are the agents. And that means that our introspective access is certainly rather different from the kind of access that anyone else could have, because they aren't in that position in relation to these acts. And that's, I think, what accounts in many ways for the puzzling fact of the privacy of consciousness and the inalienability and the difficulty to know that we share things, because as these authors, there's no obvious way in which we could step into the shoes of someone else who's in that authorial relationship to thoughts and to representations. But there's a big question which I know is still left hanging. I say several times in the book, and I think many people would want to say the same thing, that if these states of mind have evolved, then they've evolved because they have consequences in the world which natural selection can see. It must have made a difference of a kind which in the end translates into survival, biological survival, and therefore can affect genetic evolution. Now, if natural selection can see what it's like for me to see red, then presumably science ought to be able to as well. And even if you can't yet see what it's like for me to see red, there must, I think, be aspects of my overt behavior which reveal it. Now, I'm you know, it's an article of faith, that, and I don't always find it easy. Dan Dennett has, you know, just says again and again, okay, if you add in everything which results from having phenomenal experience of phenomenal red, everything in terms of its not only what we say, what we do, what our glands do, how it affects our memories and everything else. If only we could get a picture of all of it, we would have been in no doubt about what the internal experience is like. And I kind of subscribe to that because I think it must be right, because otherwise, how has natural selection ever got hold of it, got a purchase on this brain state in order to change it? But there may be as parts, and I'm certainly open to the possibility that actually there are aspects of experience which are ambiguous from the point of view of natural selection. They have consequences, but the consequences are not, this one is not necessarily superior or more, leads to greater fitness than another. And so I'm quite prepared to go along with the idea of qualia inversion, for example, that we may well have different kinds of experiences which are going to be not obvious on the surface because they didn't make any difference to natural selection. Anton, I've just seen you back. Okay, because you're drunkenly swinging around the scene. It's there's something. I mean, I think it's quite possible to hold the kind of point of view I do, and to admit of things like qualia inversion and the possibility that other minds don't correspond to ours in ways which we mind about. I mean, the analogy which I've used a long time ago is, supposing we all told the time because we had an inner watch in our heads which we could look at. Now, my watch, my clock, rotates in a clockwise way, and I read off what the time is from it. But Anton may have a clock which rotates in an anti-clockwise way, and he reads the time off of it. We'll absolutely agree about what the time is, but I think it's true to say that our experience of telling time would be different, and it wouldn't be visible because it wouldn't make any difference. Left clockwise and anti-clockwise people would be completely as capable in the world of doing the things they need to do, and so we'd pass by each other every day without having any insight into what was going on. In a paper I wrote about other minds, just on that subject, I said, well, I think it actually, nonetheless, it could be an interesting debating point. I mean, just as children in the playground love to discuss whether what I see as red is what you see as red, or could it be what you see as yellow, I think that people in close relationships, husbands and wives and so on, would be fascinated by the possibility that you have a clockwise sense of time and I have an anti-clockwise sense of time. And it would be significant in terms of our relationships, partly in terms of making us respect each other for a different reason, which we haven't talked about. It's because of our uniqueness. And that's interesting, you know, I think it's an interesting thing to think about.
Well, yes, thank you very much.
So, Nick, thank you very much for your patience and for your time, for these 2 wonderful hours with us. It was like great to see you again in our company. And
maybe lovely for me too, Anton. As I told you, I've had this horrible cold. I thought I wouldn't be able to speak today, but here I am. Grippa, I remember that word. I must learn Russian better again.
Yes. Yes.
And let's hope that day will come when I can come to Moscow and see you all again.
Yes. Let's hope for this, and let's hope that you will visit us.
Let's hope. Yeah. Okay, good. Look, it's lovely to meet you all again. Thank you very much. It's a very interesting discussion for me.
Thank you very much, Nicholas.
Okay. Okay,
thank you
very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks so much.